Alrighty, Lazy with Budget Monk, and welcome back to a new video. I'm playing the nation of Athens here. You can see we're about 24 years into the game, and look at this absolutely disgusting diplomacy, guys. So I am actually Orthodox, would you believe it? My plan from this position is to grab the aggressive expansion here, as well as here in time, 30%, as well as being Orthodox, aggressive expansion here, and improve relations. Stacking improved relations modifiers as much as I can, like advisors and established communities, having between 40 and 50, depending on our prestige, reduced aggressive expansion. For people who do not know, you actually obtain less AE from taking over your culture group, and Athens is Italian. For people who do not know, we're Tuscan culture group. And in this case, being Orthodox, I am able to, well, trading company, as this is, if we look at the subcontinent, Eastern Europe, and this is Western Europe, I have the ability to trade in company and not worry about the religious unity at all, if I like, and actually flip Catholic again later via rebels if I like. But by trading companying these, we will basically double our trade power, generate merchants in these end nodes, and be extremely affluent. But the reason I say that specifically is because my plan from this point, with that reduction of aggressive expansion and so on, is to also core quickly, because it's our group, rapidly take over and consolidate Italy with the help primarily of the Ottomans, who help against pretty much all of these nations, as they're not friendly with any of them or allied, as you can see. And yeah, just have an absolute disgusting rise. So despite the fact that Athens has a really bad ruler, and despite the fact that, you know, you're so far behind, it costs you 3 stability to declare independence against Byzantium, they actually are incredibly powerful, and it's through their diplomatic options. So I spent a lot of time grinding out different strategies as one province minor nations, really trying to find out who was the best of the best. And I've had a lot of success, you know, over the years and over the time, achieving really crazy runs as one province miners. And one of the ways in which that I'm able to kind of predict or feel comfortable playing certain nations or discerning which nations are better than others is by having an understanding of the political dynamic in Europe. And if you wish to achieve such outrageous diplomacy at such an early stage of the game with, you know, relatively weak nations, I'm going to try to explain the dynamic in 4 different concepts which help me. 2 of which are simply very much associated, one being the Italian bias and the other being the cultural bias in general, as well as the concept that I call hand-me-down diplomacy. And then finally, the Orthodox bias with Muscovy, which is pretty straightforward. But with that being said, this is the topic of this video, guys, and if you wish to understand the good diplomacy and have success yourself, stay tuned. Hope you enjoy the video. So let's start off by addressing probably the most interesting dynamic, guys, which is the sort of 2-part dynamic: cultural bias and separately but similarly the Italian bias. The cultural bias, for people who do not know, you have a bias towards your own culture. So there are ways in which, if you stop and think about it, you can take advantage of that. Now notice that I'm playing as Cyprus. We're only a mere few years into the game, and yet I'm allied to France. And I will show here, guys, if you look at these modifiers with a random nation, we are on very hard difficulty. How are we pulling one of the greatest powers in Europe as a one province minor so early into the game? Quite simple, actually. It's very easy with the same religion and the base modifiers, the estate, religious diplomats, same religion. You start at 35 relations. You could insult if you like to jump start that up there up to 60. And by improving relations, it's really easy to go over 100. And if you're lucky, they're going to flip friendly with you. Now, you might say, Monk, I've been over 100 relations with many nations many times, and they do not flip friendly. Why did France flip friendly with us immediately? Well, one of the reasons why is because we are French. And this is kind of like a hidden mechanic, which a lot of people do not actually know about. So do you know what is another French nation? Rhodes, the Knights of Rhodes. And you'll notice that often if you play the game, wherever you are in the world, leaving Europe alone, if you come look at Europe, you know, after 50 or 100 years, If the knights are in fact alive, they're very often allied to France. Now that I say it, some of you might think, oh yeah, that's true. And the reason why is because they are French. So this is an interesting dynamic. If you propose, like I am, that nations of similar or same cultures, the same cultural group, basically have a bias towards diplomacy, well, let's stop to think about this. Because the way that cultures work is they're all more or less based out of one region. So who is most likely going to be, your enemies if you're based out of a region? It's going to be the other nations who are based out of the region. So, kind of ironically, this subtle mechanic of the cultural bias is most often eclipsed by the fact that, through border friction, rivalries, missions, claims for certain areas, etc., even though there are two French nations, you don't notice the subtle bias that they have to be friends with one another because it is superseded by the fact that France just frickin' hates Burgundy and is never going to ally them. Do you understand what I'm saying? And if you think about that dynamic, there's obviously the iconic and scripted, hardwired historical friendship and so on. But, I mean, this is a pretty good example, guys. Now that you think about it, if Aragon is not rivaling you in the beginning of the game when you play Castile, they're almost always friendly, right? Or they will flip friendly very easily. And that's part of this dynamic is the cultural bias. So this is something that you can slow down and think about when analyzing a nation that you might want to play. For example, Riga or even the Livonian Order. They're actually German guys. So the Livonian Order begin with promoted culture of their lands, Estonian and Latvian, but it is not their primary culture group. They're actually Germans. So you might think, well, hang on, if we just kind of exist for a long time, many nations such as the Emperor often have too many relations, you can see there, and that is something that disincentivizes them from flipping friendly, especially with nations weaker than them, because they don't want to go even further and further over their relations. But you might say, well, hypothetically, if we're able to kind of survive and thrive out here, and Germans are rising up, will those Germans be more inclined to feel friendly with us? And the answer is yes. You don't need to actually, play for, 10 hours to experiment on that. What I'm trying to convey is that the assumption should be yes. And this is how you can get a bit of a prediction as to how certain games may go without actually playing them out. And finally, I want to talk about what is a unique culture, the Italian culture group. And Italians actually have a special mechanic. See here that we're primary culture Tuscan again as Athens. They have a special mechanic. Now, if you think about them, I can kind of understand why Paradox may give a special bias to Italians, because number one, Italians are fairly small, right? They're pretty historically prestigious nations, many of them, like, Florence and the Pope and Milan and so on, but they're not actually that large geographically or powerful. So they kind of have a little secret bias because let's think about this. Let's say you're playing as Milan. Most likely, all of the other Italians are going to be your rivals. Whereas, unlike France, let's say, who might not depend on that bias we just spoke about, the Italians are not that strong and they may need some kind of edge or mechanic, or at least that was the perception of Paradox, to give them diplomacy, considering that all of their so-called friends, Italian friends, all hate them. And this is where the Italian bias comes into play. I don't know why, because when you really take it into consideration, it really makes them quite strong. And with that being said, you will notice that if you play in and around Europe, that Savoy, Milan, Venice, once they've got, finished getting wrecked out here and settle a little bit, as well as Naples, if they're not getting PU'd or Italy's not being, colonized in general by outside powers, almost all of them typically have pretty good diplomacy. They normally end up pulling alliances from France, the Emperor, often Hungary, Bohemia, and even Iberians and so on. And the reason why, to put it simply, guys, is they have a bias for other European nations to flip friendly towards them. Now, it's a pretty subtle bias, but the major nation that is going to flip friendly is going to be France. So you'll notice that often when I actually do a lot of my hardcore runs, I do resort to using Italians. I actually did a crazy hardcore epic run somewhat recently. The VODs are over on my VOD channel right now. And we are playing as the nation of Ragusa. Ragusa is, at the end of the day, they are Italian. And that is part of the reason that I considered them and took them into consideration, knowing that I would be able to pull good diplomacy in Europe, but particularly against France. Now, why France, you might say? That's going to move on to our next topic of conversation, which is actually what I call hand-me-down diplomacy. So we're taking the perspective of the Ottomans here, and I'll just brand new game, jump into the diplomatic options here. And when we take a look, you'll see that the only people who are willing to ally us are all weaker than us. Maybe QQ is the nearest to being in similar status or strength, and the AI will often rival them. And obviously, despite being pretty much the greatest power in Europe, you know how it is, as the Ottomans, we rise through the ranks really quickly. We have very limited diplomatic options. So what is the Ottomans going to do? Are they just going to sit here with no allies because they're too large that they just turn up their nose and scoff at everybody? No. So they seem to have an increased affinity due to, of course, being the wrong religion and so on, and having more limited options. They seem to have an increased affinity, an increased willingness to actually hand out diplomacy with nations who, let's be honest, are just simply not on the same level. So if you disregard all of the mechanics that we're talking about here today, many people are probably used to playing as a nation, whoever, like Brandenburg, and you're looking at another nation, you're looking at the modifiers, and you're thinking, oh, if I could just improve them this much and get some reputation that's +5, then we will be able to actually pull an alliance. But of course, what I'm talking about is nations flipping friendly status. And if you're playing nations, you see it all the time. The Ottomans allied to Fez, Tunis, Tlemcen, Morocco, if they simply survive. But why are such small nations pulling diplomacy with one of the greatest nations in the world? It's because he simply has no other options. So the game gives them a bias where that he actually flips friendly attitude so that he can have some allies, because if they didn't flip friendly, many of these nations would struggle to ally him otherwise. And there are 3 nations in particular which are prime for this to be the case, or to pick up hand-me-down diplomacy, and that is France, Muscovy, and the Ottomans. Those are the 3 primary nations. So you do not need to be Catholic. Notice that France, 2 of these nations that I just mentioned, the Ottomans and France, often they ally one another. That's not a coincidence. It's because of their limit. There's even an event in the game now, right? The Franco-Turkish alliance. It's because of their options being quite limited. So France, that typically does well, he's going to rival who? Well, all of the other powerful dudes, right? Think about it. He's going to rival one of the Iberians, which may combine and become one Iberian. Now, maybe he doesn't, but he typically is. He's going to rival Burgundy, who may disappear. And then he switches it to the Emperor Austria, and he's going to rival England. So who does he have that really benefits him for diplomacy? Well, we just mentioned, there's 5 of these sort of great powers or pseudo great powers, right? And he can only rival 3. Now, 2 of them typically disappear, but he may ally 1 of them or 2 of them and rival the others. Okay. Now, due to his government mechanics, he has increased relations and so on, the strong duchies. He has many, many relation slots. As he begins to annex his subjects, he's got all these relation slots free. And that's why, for example, if you're a big Hungarian player like I am, you'll notice that France flips friendly. If you're a Bohemian player, they flip friendly just at the drop of a hat. And it's because you are some of the strongest nations that they could ever potentially ally at this kind of, major power status, even if you're not a great power. That's why. That is why France is when you combine the strategies we talk about, the same culture, increasing relations, they often will flip friendly at the drop of a hat. And to a lesser extent, but also the case is the Ottomans, you do not need to be Muslim. If you are a nation who's far away and you build up relations, enemy of enemy, like maybe Austria, and you have that in common, often they will flip friendly. And the other one that is really consistent, like I said, is Muscovy. Let's talk about, speaking of Muscovy, the final thing that I wish to address, which is the Orthodox bias. So here we are as nation of Trebizond, just like Cyprus, only a mere few years into the game, and on very hard difficulty, we're still able to pull Muscovy, unsurprising to many people, I imagine, because we have a nickname in my community of Muscovy being the Ortho Dad. He's basically willing to protect any nation who is Orthodox, and that's both him and Russia as well, by the way. So if, say, for some freaky reason, Novgorod formed Russia, they're going to behave the same way. And it's not only just because they are Orthodox, guys, but it's also, like I just got finished talking about the hand-me-down diplomacy, Muscovy has very few options of nations who are willing to ally him. So despite us being of a pretty limited strength, he still values you somewhat because relatively all the other nations are weak as well. And I will say that you do not need to be Orthodox. You know, you could be playing a nation like Bohemia, and you could be having a common enemy like the PLC. And if you're wondering, you know, they're quite far away, there's a large distance penalty, maybe you're on very hard difficulty, maybe you're not, but there's a penalty there, and they're a different religion, I'm not sure that I can really, you know, get their relations far over 100, and are they going to flip friendly with me? The answer is yes, absolutely yes. They will flip friendly with you, and the best way, it's just a matter of when they're going to flip friendly with you. The best way to make it occur sooner is to be somewhat aware of basically asserting yourself and flexing and as appearing as strong as possible in terms of your manpower and your debt and so on. If you're Bohemia and you get over 100 relations due to enemy of enemy, that sort of thing, and then you really run your country into the ground, you know, making as many big plays as possible early, he's actually going to be less likely to ally you relatively to being in a position where you have full manpower, full force limit, and maybe even you're just playing tall to keep that up. So keep that in mind. The more of a liability that you look like, and it also in terms of coalition and aggressive expansion, the less likely they are going to be to ally you. But the answer is yes. Due to the hand-me-down mechanic and dynamic, Muscovy is just prime to ally you. So I wanted to shoot this video with the intention to help you guys theorize about games before they begin, because that is what I have a lot of experience doing by now, and basically having a solid, at least from a diplomatic perspective, ability to predict what it would be like to play out a campaign as various different nations to achieve very difficult goals. What are your options available in terms of switching religions and utilizing certain options or allying certain nations that you may not be aware that you can simply ally, which are going to make your life really easy as long as you're very deliberate and careful, don't get on their bad side. I hope that this was informative, that you enjoyed this video, that you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.